When the election's over. We are going to have an election that takes place on a beautiful day, November 3rd. And usually at the end of the evening, they say, Donald Trump has won the election. Donald Trump is your new president. Whatever they say, you know what? You're not going to know this, possibly, if you really did it right, for months or for years. Because these ballots are all going to be lost. They're going to be gone.
If he were a paid agent of a foreign country, he could not be more effective in undermining the institutions of American democracy. And in an op-ed for the Washington Post titled, "Trump is actively working to undermine the Postal Service and every major U.S. institution," retired Navy Admiral William McRaven, former commander of the U.S. Special Operation Command, the ones who hunted down and killed bin Laden, writes in part this: "Today, as we struggle with social upheaval, soaring debt, record unemployment, a runaway pandemic, and rising threats from China and Russia, President Trump is actively working to undermine every major institution in this country. He has planted the seeds of doubt in the minds of many Americans that our institutions aren't functioning properly. And if the president doesn't trust the intelligence community, law enforcement, the press, the military, the Supreme Court, the medical professionals, elected officials, and the postal workers, then why should we? And if Americans stop believing in the system of institutions, then what is left but chaos? And who can bring order out of chaos? Only Trump. It is the theme of every autocrat who ever seized power or tried to hold on to it." It's bringing right now staff writers for The Atlantic magazine, David Frum and Ann Applebaum. Ann's latest book is titled The Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. Also with us, columnist for The Washington Post, George Will. And what is so interesting about this collection of people is, Ann, as you write about it in your book, there was a time not so long ago where we would all be considered right-of-center conservatives, economic conservatives who believed in liberal, traditionally liberal views of the economy, of free trade, of smaller government. And of course, I think most of us were defined by the Cold War and our belief in the superiority of our system over the old Soviet system. But you saw what William McRaven said today, and suddenly the word conservative, not only in this country, but as you describe in countries across the globe, is far different than what it was just a few years ago.
Yes, that's correct. Look, the conservative movement as it was in the 1980s or 1990s was really a coalition, and it was held together by dislike of the Soviet Union, by anti-communism. But actually, the people who were members of it were motivated by many different things. Some of them were free marketeers, some of them were Christians, some of them were in favor of realpolitik, and therefore they opposed the Soviet geopolitics. And when the Cold War broke up, it took some time, but that coalition eventually broke up too. And lots of people who were members of it found that in the post-Cold War era, they didn't have that much in common with one another anymore. And what we're seeing in a lot of countries is the breakup of what used to be called the conservative movement into different groups, very often into a radical, often authoritarian or anti-democratic group, and others who see themselves as still part of a democratic mainstream, who still believe in conservative ideas about economics and about how government should run.
Yeah, and George Will, I grew up, of course, reading your columns, reading your books as a conservative. And I know you find yourself, and David finds himself, and I find myself in the same position that Ann writes about regarding friends that she's had for decades that no longer consider themselves friends because of politics. And she said, "We found ourselves on opposite sides of a profound divide, one that runs through not only what used to be the Polish right, but also the old Hungarian right, the Spanish right, the French right, the Italian right, and with some differences, the British right and the American right, too. This is not just about Donald Trump, is it?
No, it's not. And what makes Anne's book such a bracing read is this. Anne is a transatlantic figure. She's lived from Poland to London to Washington. She knows the conservative movement in its many manifestations. And what she is writing about, and what I think we're experiencing today, is the Europeanization of American conservatism. European conservatives, in a sense, have a history of throne and altar, blood and soil, tribalism. American conservatism, quite different, welcomed the individualism and the churning of American capitalism. The crowning irony of the last 3 years or so is that Donald Trump, setting out to make America great again, set out to make America more European in the sense that it has injected this kind of tribalism and made it normal in our politics. This has coincided with the fact that a lot of American conservatives are shocked because they are Christians and the society is increasingly secular. And third, American conservatives have bought into the cult of victimization. They like to feel that they are put upon by academics, Hollywood, the media, and all the rest, and that they are an embattled minority in their own country. This makes for a very toxic brew.
Yeah, you know, David Frum, it's so interesting. First time I met you, 1994, I just arrived in Washington. And it's fascinating. You know, I went up to you and said, hey, I bought Dead Right, which at the time was considered, you know, this great right-wing track. And it just reminds me, in 94, I was considered too conservative, and Newt Gingrich said this, I was too conservative for the Republican Party to support in 1994. Your book, Dead Right, was considered in many circles being far too right-wing. And I remember Jeb Bush, campaigning with Jeb Bush in 94, and he was seen as the crazy Bush. He was, again, far too right. And now here we find ourselves in 2020, and what is defined as being conservative, what is defined as being far too right, it doesn't even register on the scale of how, you know, what we believe conservatism was our entire lives.
So you're exactly right. And one of the reasons that this election is so important is that one of the ballot issues is the renewal of the Republican Party. If Donald Trump loses, and if his enablers in the Senate experience the pain, the education that comes from pain, we have a chance to renew a center-right party worthy of the name. I'm speaking to you this morning from the Canadian province of Ontario, where there is one of the most conservative governments in North America, with an approval rating of over 66%, much higher than the national Liberals of Justin Trudeau. Why? Because they've handled the pandemic competently, not perfectly, but competently, and with and demonstrating that they have concern and care for the people who have gotten sick and who are suffering. You can have a normal conservative party again. We are seeing the consequences of bad choices, and the way we get out of this is through good choices. And so I think we're going to rediscover in the next few years why right-of-center parties are necessary and how we rebuild them. But that begins by moving out of this dead end of Trumpism, which is not only so, as George Will said, so un-American, but also so manifestly incompetent and has driven this country into such extraordinary crisis.
You know, and there are times where over the past several years, I've convinced myself that Donald Trump is simply ignorant. I think one of the bracing things about your book, one of the frightening things about your book is the fact that what Donald Trump is doing here, you describe happening in Poland in 2015. You've described what's been happening with Orban in Hungary for quite some time, and that is first you go after the courts, then you go after the media, then you go after the state. And there's one line that's particularly chilling, given what Donald Trump has said about the post office. In your introduction, you say, there was very little pretense about any of this. He's just doing it out in the open. They just do it out in the open. As you explained, they don't have the constitutional means to do it, so they just redefine the political arguments.
Yes, I mean, look, you know, there are patterns that other governments have followed. If you are elected to office, of course, you have the right to rule. You have the right to make laws. You have the right to make your arguments. What you don't have the right to do is to undo the system and to make it impossible or to make it difficult for your opposition ever to beat you again. And there are a number of instances. I mean, we could include Venezuela in this. We could include Turkey. We could include a number of other countries where people are elected to power, and then they begin to dismantle the system that creates a level playing field that makes another election possible. And what we've seen Donald Trump do very openly, as you say, I mean, he's never really hidden it or denied it, nor has the people who are now leading the Republican Party. What we're watching him do is essentially cheat. He's trying to change the rules. The reason he wants to undermine the media is so that the media can't report on his corruption and on his incompetence. The reason that he wants to harm the post office is so that Americans won't be able to vote easily. The reason the Republicans talk about, endlessly about, voter deception that doesn't exist is to undermine people's faith in the voting system. The reason why Republican governors and mayors in some states have made it more difficult for people in Black or underprivileged neighborhoods to vote is so that they lower the vote. I mean, these are old tools, and they're used in a lot of different places to make sure that there isn't an even playing field, so that the opposition can't compete easily. Of course he's incompetent, but it's an incompetence that's part of a pattern, and it's a pattern that we know from other places.
And George Will, Anne starts her book talking about her friends at a New Year's Eve party, as you know, that she had at the end of the century, the end of the millennium, and talks about these people that they don't communicate with anymore, that there's been this huge division on the right, not just in Poland, but across the country. I'm just curious, though, the thing that I have the most trouble with are those colleagues that I came to Congress with in 1994, and we were fighting for conservatism, for balanced budgets, for to hold China and Russia and other countries accountable when it came to human rights. And you could go down the list because you reported on us. Yet so many of those same people are remaining silent as Donald Trump, it's Donald Trump this weekend said, we're not going to fund an institution that has 91% approval rating with the American people, because if we fund that institution, then people will be able to vote by mail. And silence on the Republican Party side. How have you come to grips with this? How have you come to terms with this?
Well, silence would be an improvement from some of these people, but leaving that aside, the bad news and the sort of good news are linked. The bad news is that when people have, as the congressional Republicans have done, shed so many principles so fast, so thoroughly, over 3.5 years, you begin to wonder if they know what it is to be principled at all. On the other hand, they have shown such, so we say, versatility of conviction in the last few years. Having shed so many principles, when Donald Trump disappears, as I expect him to do soon, they're going to look around and perhaps they'll reacquire some, at least of the rhetorical professions that they used to have, which is to say they've proven themselves malleable, and that's the bad news, and it's also potentially the good news.
Yeah, but David, Frum, again, going back to the 90s, going back even to 2010 with the Tea Party movement, conservatives, self-proclaimed conservatives, fought for balanced budgets. They fought for smaller federal government. They fought for all the things that Donald Trump is not. I mean, you look, and Donald Trump, even before the pandemic, gave us the largest deficits ever, the biggest federal debt ever, gave us the biggest federal budget ever, the biggest explosion in domestic spending ever, the biggest explosion in defense spending ever. I mean, every single thing these people fought for over 20 years got tossed aside overnight when Donald Trump won the nomination.
And yet, I think George Will is absolutely right. For the past 2 years, I've had at the top of my Twitter feed a prediction: when all of this is over, nobody will ever admit to ever having been for any of it. It's going to disappear down the memory hole, and then we are going to face the wreckage Donald Trump left behind and some important choices, and politics will resume. We're going to have this enormous debt left over from the pandemic response. What do we do about it? How does the country meet its obligations? How do we restore the world free trading system that Donald Trump has so badly damaged? How do we reassert American leadership in a world in which so many people have lost faith in the United States, and in which China is objectively so much stronger than it was when Donald Trump came to power? There is going to be work to do. And so I think all of us who are watching this program, we need to get through what has to be done as rapidly as possible, because there's going to be real politics returning to America soon. And we're not going to be, as Ann warns, dealing with these challenges to the system, we hope. If only Donald Trump can be sent on his way to Mar-a-Lago or whatever other federal institution he's going to, if he can be set on his way, you can get back to a world in which there's normal politics, in which people disagree in the way that people can constructively do to reach good ends for the country as a whole.
And Ann, in Twilight of Democracy, and by the way, I'm glad I don't have to pay royalties every time I mention your book, or else I would be paying for an edition on your home. But you bring up a great point. You say Trump supporters they do not fit the lazy stereotypes that even they put on themselves, and that the press puts on themselves. They are not all poor and rural. They are not all impoverished. They are all not high school dropouts, that in fact, some are quite wealthy, doing quite well, went to the best schools in America and across the world, and are using those gifts, those blessings, actually to help authoritarians across the globe.
Yeah, no, I've always disliked from the very beginning this idea that Trumpism, or the Brexit vote in England were somehow the product of, as the cliche has it, the white working class. I mean, the fact is that in the United States, the poorest Americans did not vote for Donald Trump, that economics does not fully explain what's going on. It's a part of the explanation, but not all of it. And that a lot of the people who work around Trump and for Trump, just like they work around and for would-be authoritarians in other countries, are extremely well educated. They understand the world very well. They are the product of, as you say, the best schools and the best universities. And they are using their skills and talents to promote him and to promote their own interests and their own benefit. And we've kind of closed our eyes to the fact, to the millionaires and billionaires who work for Donald Trump, and to the very well-off, well-off people in suburbs and in cities as well, who've also supported him. And they, in order to understand what they're doing, you need a more sophisticated frame of reference than the one that many have used. The stereotypes don't explain it. You need also to look at the cultural despair and the anger that a lot of conservatives feel about America. And as you said, this sense of victimization that explains so much. These are also an important part of the story.
George Will is one who not only reported on Ronald Reagan, but spent enough time around Ronald Reagan to know him. What would President Reagan be saying about the erosion of democracy, not only in America, but also in Poland and Hungary? What's going on in Belarus right now?
I think he'd say, first of all, lighten up and be more cheerful. This is not a fragile country. It was not made by fragile people. But he also would say this. The left at one point had to police its excesses, that is, those who became fellow travelers of foreign despots, either Lenin or Stalin or Castro, and the left purged them and disciplined them. Today, conservatives have to do the same thing. There is a faction in American conservatism that thinks Mr. Orban of Hungary is really cool. He's not.
My God. I know.
He's a garden variety authoritarian, and people who flirt with him should be forever ruled out of the conversation on the American right. And Ann's book, by the way, is particularly salient, dealing with Orban and the perverse appeal he has.
And David, I know you've seen that as well. It's shocking. Again, people I know, people whose views on conservatism I've probably agreed with the overwhelming majority of time throughout my life, are fanboys of Orban. And there is just, there's no explaining that away other than these same people having a disrespect for basic democratic institutions.
They also are gripped by despair. I mean, to pick up on what George Will said about Ronald Reagan, that I think the thing that made Reagan such an inspiring figure in the early 1980s was his incredible confidence in America and his incredible confidence in the American idea, what America stood for, not only to Americans, but to people elsewhere. Donald Trump has always spoken negatively, has always spoken pessimistically. And that mood of despair has spread to many of the people who follow him. You know, for those of us who reach a certain age, our personal futures imply decline leading to ultimate extinction. So it's very natural for us to assume that that's true for the country as a whole, that if we're becoming more decrepit, the country must be becoming more decrepit. But politics that appeals is politics that offers hope and purpose. Donald Trump has never offered hope. He doesn't know that language. And his most important supporters, they offer the opposite. They offer gloom and fear and terror and decline and a message that touches people of a certain age, but that repulses everybody else, and that isn't true. That we have the ability, as Ronald Reagan kept promising, to restore and renew the country. And when we do, we're going to discover that the ideas of 1989 that Ann so eloquently talks about, the ideas that brought you into Congress in 1994, that they can be repurposed for a new era. But first, we have to get to a point where we all agree that the way you compete is by competing for votes, not by competing for ways to stop people from voting.
And then you talk about the future of nostalgia. You know, George Will is and David Frum talking about the despair and the victimization that Trumpists and people who certain people on the right have embraced. You talk about it about men who were mentors in your life early on. You know, just talking about a lost England and almost driving them to madness in their political views.
So yeah, that's to do with specifically to do with Britain, but we see this everywhere as well. That people who dislike the present or who are uncomfortable with what their countries have become very often begin to look to previous eras. They look back to different times and romanticize them and seek to bring them back, not in a aesthetic way or by repurposing the ideas, but literally to bring them back. And this is what many nationalist projects are founded on. We want to bring back the time when we were young or when our grandparents were young and we remember the country being a certain way. And you can very much see that as a facet of Trumpism as well, that a kind of cartoon vision of the 1950s, when men were men and women were at home and there were no people of other races visible in public life. That's the view, that's the image that they want to bring back. And that's the moment when they say make America great again, that's what they mean. They mean let's make it when it was run according to a certain way. And this is a way of denying the present and denying all of the good things that have happened in America over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 decades, and denying what the diverse nature of the country and the incredible potential that it has. And so I agree with David. It's also a form of solipsistic and self-centered pessimism. I'm pessimistic because things aren't the way I remember them. And that really leaves no space for young people, for new ideas, for refreshing visions of what the country can become.
Right. Yeah, which, of course, leads to Donald Trump tweeting about great news, housewives in suburbia. It's almost like he's in Chevy Chase in 1957. Anyway, Ann Applebaum, thank you so much. David Frum and George Will, greatly appreciate all of you being here. It means so much. I appreciate it. And coming up next,